Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Patreon podcast. This week I wanted to talk about my process and methodology for completing an album. This is both from like a mechanical and a creative standpoint because it's hard to tell when an album is quote unquote done, but there's also a lot of just kind of busy work that goes into finishing an album and putting it out into the world. So this is really kind of hot off the heels of me releasing The Moon Seems Unaffected, which, if you haven't listened to yet, I hope you do soon. I was going to say it's very good, but I try to stay distant from my releases, and I'm actually really, really proud of this release, and I hope you do listen to it. But, I wanted to talk about let's just start from when I think an album is done. So in this case, it's a little bit more of a unique situation because I have a very hard deadline where I need to finish the album by the end of the month of November, which I did, but I also released it a couple days early because I felt like the music that was on there was essentially as much as I wanted to express through the songs. And it's kind of similar to writing a song where you get to a point where you could add more, but would it add more value to the music? Would it add more context or emotion to what you were trying to convey through that particular song? And I get to a point in an album where I listen to it and I'm like, I could add more. I could add another song. I could make these edits. But would it really benefit the song or the album as a whole if I did that? And for the most part, I got to the point where I was listening to the album and I was just like, this is good enough. And I've talked about good enough before. Good enough doesn't mean it's your like minimum standards of quality. Good enough means like this is, I'm going to experience diminishing returns if I continue to work on this because I could continue to tweak it, and I probably will tweak it a little bit more, and I'll get into that in a second. But it's just not worth the time because in the time that it would take for me to go and re-render all the songs and re-change all of the mixing and mastering and maybe change a couple notes around, and all the time that I could do that, I could write like 2 or 3 more songs because it just takes a long time to sit down and render all that stuff out. Because the edits themselves don't take time, but the way that I have my mastering set up is I export a pre-master and then I bring that pre-master into the mastering chain or the mastering project, and then I master it from there. And it's just like, it just takes a long time. It probably takes 5 or 10 minutes to make one little edit to the album at this point because it's all set up. So yeah, I found that good enough, and that good enough is really important. And that's a very personal threshold that you need to find for yourself. But it's still something that you need to find. And really that's the point that I can't help as much about because that's personal experience. That's personal. That's I guess it's just really personal. It's all about what you feel your music is. But finding that point is really important. And once you find that point and that you know the album is done, then you're able to start working on the more kind of logistical parts of it. And I said that this, and really all National Solo Album Month albums are kind of similar with this, where I release it on Bandcamp, and then I spend another week or two making edits to the project, and then I release it to digital distribution, and I update the Bandcamp. This is really good for me because under the time pressure of the Album in a Month challenge, I tend to cut corners a little bit. And it's just like the same thing with the 2-hour track challenge. Like, it's so easy to just finish something, but it's not really, it doesn't have the polish that you want. And that's why I'm saying that this is a little bit more of a unique album in that circumstance. But for the most part, you release an album and you want to release it to Bandcamp and DistroKid or CD Baby or Spotify directly or whatever, just to digital distribution. The first thing you have to figure out is, do you want a coordinated release or do you want a staggered release? And when you're releasing a digital distribution, you need to be thinking 3 or 4 weeks ahead if you want a coordinated release. Like, it's so easy to just put something out on SoundCloud or YouTube or Bandcamp and just be done with it and be like, hey, it's out there. But when you're working with streaming services, you have to worry about, well, this one's going to take 2 weeks to get into the system. This one's going to take 3 weeks. And there's a lot more planning that has to be done. And that's why with this release, I wanted to put it out on Bandcamp at the end of November, because I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that the challenge was completed, and I was completing it successfully. But I also wanted to get this album out by the end of the year on streaming services, because this album is a reflection of my thoughts on the year of 2020 and kind of my feelings. And I wanted to get it out there as soon as possible, because I feel like it's appropriate for this to be released in 2020. I am tentatively, I haven't finished it yet, but I'm tentatively on trying to get it out on New Year's Eve. And I think that would be kind of a fun thing, that some people might sit down and listen to the album and maybe share in some of the experiences that I had. But being able to plan like that is not easy. Like, I have a Trello board, I have a bunch of other stuff just usually open all the time, where I can look and be like, okay, well, this album's coming out in a couple days, so I should try to hype it up or something like that. And it's so difficult to get that kind of exposure, that kind of traction when it comes to this, especially as a smaller artist. Like, there's only so much you can do. Personally, I like DistroKid because it gives you the hyperfollow page, which essentially, when it aggregates out to, when you submit your album, it gets aggregated out to like Apple Music and Spotify, and I think YouTube Music may or may not be a thing anymore. Everything changes all the time. But it when it pushes stuff out to those major services, it just creates a page full of links, so you can just direct somebody to that page, and then they can choose the service they prefer. And I like that a lot. So that's good for trying to get people interested in the music that you do. But having that gap of time where the album is done but it's not out can be stressful, because it's like you want it out there, you want to share it with people, but the machinations of these larger companies just takes time. So that kind of planning is important. I kind of lost my train of thought on this one, but I just feel that it's important to understand when an album is done. And just kind of getting back to the creative part of this, because the mechanical part isn't that interesting. I really struggle, especially with a greater album still. I really struggle trying to find out when an album is complete, because I always want to add more. This album in particular, I wanted to add more. The goal for these National Solo Album Months is 29 minutes, and I ended up with 60. And my goal was 60 because the music comes together so fast, but I was starting to struggle at the end of the month because I just couldn't think of anything else to add to the album. And at that point, I was running into kind of conflicting emotions, where I felt like I needed to make that 60-minute mark, but I also needed to respect the album for what it was and not try to just artificially inflate it with music that doesn't necessarily belong in there. And I'm not really sure how I did with that. I guess I'm just going to have to let other people decide whether or not I added bloat to the album. I don't feel that I did, but I worry that I did. Because, like, how I feel doesn't necessarily affect what actually happened. But yeah, once I felt like the album was done, and I was running out of time, so I didn't really have much of a choice. But in prior Naso Elmos, like Felt Cute Might Delete Later, I finished the album, and then I took some time to kind of let it simmer and let it sit. And then I kind of revisited the album and made more edits, and I added more songs, and that works well for me as well, because letting it sit helps kind of give you a little bit of distance in time between you finishing all this music and then you releasing all this music. And I think that having that distance is really important. And it's not something that, that's probably another topic that I could get into at some point. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about mind flooding this episode. I forget what I talked about last week. I'll do that episode next. But I feel that it's important to let things sit and let things simmer for a little bit, where you're done with the music and you're not actively working on the music for the album, but you're still listening to it once in a while, where you can just kind of pop it on and listen to it. And another thing that I do is when I'm listening to it, I take a lot of notes where I'm like, okay, this song at this section, at this timestamp, I need to change the band pass or the frequency because it's too harsh in the highs or something like that. So I have this big long list of things that I need to do, and then I can just sit down and do them. And that's more of like just a menial task. It's not a creative task. It's a mechanical task where I'm just sitting down and going through this laundry list of edits that needs to happen, and learning to trust yourself. Your past self is really important, where it's just like you don't always have the luxury of being in the environment where you heard that particular issue before, but it's still there. So you have to kind of go in and you have to go and change that based off of what you said in the past. And sometimes, I listen to something and being like, past Ben, what are you talking about? This is dumb. But that's often not the case. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Like I don't really know what else to talk about with this. I hope this is valuable to somebody out there. I kind of feel like I'm rambling on with this one, but how is that different from most of the other ones these days? I really do appreciate talking about this stuff and having an outlet to talk about it with. And if you have any questions or if you want me to clarify something, I'm more than happy to do that. Just leave a comment. Or reach out to me on Twitter or whatever. It's totally fine. But yeah, like releasing an album's hard, especially if you've never done it before. There's a lot of pressure to do it right, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed when really it's the same thing as releasing a song except a little bit more significant. So just keep that in mind. Just I don't know. Just keep moving. Kind of lost my steam on this one. Thank you so much for listening, though. I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much for being a Patreon supporter. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful week, and I will talk to you next Friday. Be remarkable.